AK Ramanujan is our own poet, and we all got exposed to his poetry through Kannada. And the second reason, of course, is we have the two editors of this book with us, two associates of Ramanujan. One, Guillermo, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Guillermo.
Guillermo and Krishna, who have been introduced to you. Certainly, both of them will be talking about the book and also reading from the book. And I would like to begin with a few initial remarks. Ramanujan, as I told earlier, came to us as a very, very different, unique kind of poet. We at the time in the 50s and early 60s, Kannada was full of modernity, or Navya Kavya, and Navya Vimarsha, modern criticism. And we had the high, serious, completely image-wrought poetry of Adiga. And before that, we had our Bendre and Kuvempu. And Ramanujan came here, in a way, making his own path and disturbing the way in which we were used to read poetry. Not only read, but to see what is it that makes it a poem. That way, Ramanujan was very difficult to classify. He was a modernist, but only not that, because he went back to epics. So every description of Ramanujan contradicts itself. So we can call him an imagist, because his poetry is full of images, but then he's trying to tease out meaning, not with his images, but with the gap between the images that he produces. And then, of course, we can call him an impressionist, because and it becomes more clear when we listen to the readings from the book that he was writing his diaries in an impressionistic mode most of the time. So in a way, he defies all classification. I think the best way to look at Ramanujan's poetry is to remember what Frost said: best poetry communicates even before it is understood. So Ramanujan's poem could be understood, or it communicates rather, but not easy to understand. For instance, in Kannada, this is how, I'll read one in English and one in Kannada, which is easy in one sense, but not so easy if we once again try to look at it. This is called Self-Portrait. It's a very well-known short poem from the Sreedhara, 1966. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father. So there is this father figure coming to him again and again, and more about it perhaps later. Because the father here can stand for many, many things: for tradition, for authority, something that has been handed over to us. And then in Kannada, ಈ ಪದ್ಯ ಅಂತೂ ಭಾಳ ಜನ ಕೋಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಬಚ್ಚಲು ಮನೆಯ ಗಂಗಾಳ್ ಅಪ್ಪ ಮಗ ಅಂತ ಆ ಪದ್ಯದ ಹೆಸರು. 4 ಲೈನಿನ ಪದ್ಯ. ಬಚ್ಚಲು ಮನೆಯ ಗಂಗಾಳದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಪ್ಪ ಮರೆತ ಹೊಸ ಹಲ್ಲು ಸ್ವತಂತ್ರವಾಗಿ ಹಲ್ಲು ಕಿರಿಯಿತು, ನಾನು ನೋಡಿದೆ. ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಪದ್ಯ. ಆದರೆ ಅದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಸುಮಾರಷ್ಟು ವಿಪುಲವಾದ ವಿಮರ್ಶೆ ಬಂದಿದೆ. Because I think Ramanujan wrote such poems which lent themselves very beautifully to what was then popular, called modern criticism, where the text is the most important thing and nothing beyond the text. So we see that most of our Kannada critics trying to interpret these poems line by line, but still saying there is still something more we have not covered. The first impression that one gets of Ramanujan poetry is that he is a wizard of words. He plays with words, as in this poem. Images consult one another, a conscience-stricken jury, and come slowly to a sentence. So this is looks like a play on words. Something similar to this is in Kannada too, which juxtaposes different images. ಮೈ ಉರಿಯುವ ಕೋಪದಲ್ಲಿ ಮನೆಗೆ ಬಂದೆ, ಹೊರಗೆ ತೋಟ, ಕೆಂಡ ಸಂಪಿಗೆ ಮರ ಹೂ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಿಂತಿತ್ತು. ಸೊ ಈ ಥರ ಪದ್ಯಗಳು ಬಂದಾಗ ಹೊಸದಾಗಿ ಇದ್ದದ್ದ ಈ ಪದ್ಯಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಹೆಂಗೆ ವಿಮರ್ಶೆ ಮಾಡೋದು ಅನ್ನೋದೇ ಒಂದು ವಿಮರ್ಶಕರಿಗೆ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಸವಾಲಾಗಿತ್ತು. So we see that there are many recurring themes in Ramanujan's poetry, which perhaps becomes more clear when we get into the book, his diaries. But anyway, he was the one who was always thinking about the past, because that is where he saw the future, in his own words. So this kind of moving from one time to another, he compares it to a whale moving from one ocean to another throughout the year to complete this life cycle. So past is something that he thought should be endured, written about, rethought with a smile, perhaps with an ironic smile. In one of his interviews with Ramchandra Sharma in Kannada AIR, All India Radio, he says that a change of style is also a change of subject. So the question remains whether did he continuously experiment with change in his style of writing poetry, because he wanted to deal with different things. I'll stop with brief introduction, and I would like to really go back to these two associates and editors of the book. Two remarks. One, it's not easy to bring any modern theory to understand and completely exploit, quote unquote, Ramanujan's poetry. But there is a lot of universities, English departments, which are using his works, his short stories, translations, to teach post-colonial theory, which they lend themselves beautifully to it. And here is a small poem. Before that, see, in Kannada modernity was introduced to us by one English professor, because Kannada has this long tradition of English professors writing Kannada poetry, starting from B.M. Shri and to Ramanujan, Shivaprakash, etc. B.M. Shrikantaya was a professor of English in Mysore, translated some poems into Kannada. He called it English Geetagalu, English songs. Of course, he did not choose the best of English poetry, but still chose one that would lend themselves to the Kannada rhythm. And then he says that one second. So B.M. Shri, in his introduction to that poem, anthology of translated poems from English to Kannada, says in his introduction, ಅವಳ ತೊಡುಗೆ ಇವಳಿಗಿಟ್ಟು ನೋಡ ಬಯಸಿದೆ, ಇವನ ಉಡುಗೆ ಅವನಿಗಿಟ್ಟು ಹಾಡ ಬಯಸಿದೆ. What it means is, he's saying that his translation from English to Kannada is like dressing an Indian lady in a foreign dress, in a foreign frock or something like that. So for him, the colonial transaction was like a play, easy. But now, after many years, poets, writers, critics realized that colonial transaction is not such a simple thing. And Ramanujan has a take on that, on B.M. Shri's small 2 lines. So he says, Avali Javali. Doddavaru Madidarendu, that is the reference to B.M. Shri. ದೊಡ್ಡವರು ಮಾಡಿದರೆಂದು ಇವಳ ತೊಳಿಗೆ ಅವಳಿಗಿಟ್ಟು, ಇವಳ ತೊಳಿಗೆ ಅವಳಿಗಿಟ್ಟು ಹಾಡ ಬಯಸಿದೆ. ಏನಾಯಿತು ಗೊತ್ತೇ? ಅವಳ ಸೀರೆ ಇವಳು ಹರಿದು, ಇವಳ ಸೀರೆ ಅವಳು ಹರಿದು ಓಡ ಬಯಸಿದೆ. ಹಾಳಾಗಿ ಹೋಗಲೆಂದು ಅವನ ಉಡಿಗೆ ಇವಳಿಗುಡಿಸಿ, ಇವನ ಉಡಿಗೆ ಇವಳ ಉಡಿಗೆ ಅವನಿಗುಡಿಸಿ ನೋಡಬಯಸಿದೆ. ಕೆಟ್ಟ ಜನರು ಕಿಟಕಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಎಣಕಿ ನೋಡಿ ರಸಿಕನೆಂದು ಗೇಲಿ ಮಾಡಿ ಸಂತೆ ಕೂಡಿತು. ಪೊಲೀಸು ಪಡೆಯು ಬಂದು ನನ್ನ ಶೀಲ ತನಿಖೆಯಾಗಿ ದಂಡ ತೆತ್ತೆನು. This is how it ends. So he's actually, making not fun of him, but telling that this kind of changing of dress is not easy, and it can create a very, very bizarre and many times unlikely kind of situations. It's also a lot can be read into this poem in terms of the act of translation also. What happens when you bring poems from one language to another. So more about it again later. And now I would like to invite these two. See, these two editors who have gone through this material, which Guillermo chanced upon, which was stored very meticulously in Chicago Library. So they have gone through, sifted all those. I think they were in 70 boxes, you see, right? Okay. And then carefully edited and brought out this volume, which reads like an independent book actually, which gives a glimpse into the inner landscape, is something that he always liked to use, the inner landscape of the poet. So let's begin. Both of you have written different introductions. Okay. When I read them, I thought Krishna was writing. He mentions that this book is a kind of metaphorical journey, and you try to look at it from a kind of as a psychological narrative, if I'm right. So may I begin with Krishna asking him, in what sense do you look at it as a metaphorical journey of a poet?
First, I want to say thank you all for coming today, and it's nice to see old friends of my father's here, and my uncle, AK Sreedhara, who is my father's brother. Very happy to see you all. Well, the book has many different kinds of journeys in it. One is the physical, literal journeys, and the book actually began with Guillermo discovering a travel log of my father's travel from, he got a Fulbright scholarship and he traveled from India to America on a boat. And as he did that, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Just,
good,
okay.
it's good.
Okay. As he did that, as he traveled, on the boat letterhead, he wrote a travel log, which was very beautiful and literary. And Guillermo discovered this in the papers, and it struck him that this travel log should be published. As well, there were pages from, they traveled through France and they stayed in hotels, and on the letterhead of those hotels, he had scribbled these very descriptive experiences he was having as he was traveling from the U.S., from India to the U.S. And the journey itself is a metaphor for his growth as a human, as moving across. It's a story of an immigrant moving to America. And we see this repeated throughout the book, different times when he's moving and traveling and recording these experiences, either in poetry or as descriptions. And as well, we see the arc of his life. The book reads, if you read the whole thing quickly, it reads as a kind of autobiography or memoir, because he kept journals all through his life. So there's a very good record of his life from his own voice, which we were able to put together. And we had kind of a central theme to not make this so much of a personal, a book about his personal inner world, but actually a book about creativity, his views on creativity, his process of creativity, and actually the literary entries, the drafts of the poems, the experiences which we see then reflected in the finished work later. And so we had a very clear vision of the book, and I think that made the book a success, is that we knew exactly what we wanted, and there was so much material to choose from. So it gave us a very good focus when we were actually collecting material. Guillermo had done a lot of it beforehand, and I went to Chicago 2 summers ago into the archives and collected more materials. We had discussed kind of the gaps in the material that we had to be able to create this arc of his entire life. And I think it's quite interesting how it reads almost novelistic in that way. You see him progress as a person from this young, naive South Indian man into someone who he began to transcend his own doubts about himself by the end of his life and his own struggle with his own identity. So it was a good exercise, and it was really fantastic working with Guillermo on this. So why don't you say some more, Guillermo?
Anyway, before that, I thought, since you referred to it as a kind of metaphorical journey of a poet, more than a personal diary, on page 100, I saw an interesting comment. Talking about metaphor, Ramanujan says, but the metaphor was too real to stay metaphor for me, for him, in other words. This is the other thing that happens to me all the time. Everything becomes metaphorical for me, but only for a moment. So if you look at metaphor as something that covers the face, so the face becoming the mask is a theme that he comes back to. So do you think the diary also in a way illustrates a lot of this happening?
Can you say, what exactly do you mean by that?
What I mean is that he says that many things that he writes in this can be seen as allegorical, metaphorical. But he himself says that the metaphor stays only for a short while. It becomes real soon.
Well, that idea is seen over and over in his poems. Yeah. And we see this in, we were going to read a river, or even the Strider's poem, where you see the idea of metaphor, or the idea of symbols. He flips that into something very rationalist and realist. And so, in that sense, he is moving away. He moves from metaphor, and then it's lost into something very real.
So there's a constant shift.
Yeah.
So we may, as you say, come back to that a little later. So, Guillermo, can you tell us about your experience of going through all these archival materials?
Thank you.
And what is it that made you, what is the criteria you used to arrange them in a particular way?
Is this working? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I would really like to thank the organizers, Bangalore International Center and Ravi, for having organized and hosted this. We've just started this tour around India. Yesterday we were at Kerala Literature Festival, but we knew that this session today would be and is very special to us because we're in Bangalore, where his family is. And so in a way, this is a celebration. It would have been his 90th birthday. This is another reason why we wanted to bring out the book, and I think it should be mentioned since his family is here. And I think we want to dedicate this a homage to AK Ramanujan, and also to his relations with the family and the wider relations with friends, and very especially to Girish Karnad, who wrote the foreword to the book and was a very dear friend and guru to us, and to their friendship. So to Girish's and Ramanujan's relationship and friendship, we dedicate this session. I think we would love to take you on this journey today, and we have structured a part of the session we wanted to be the readings. We want the voice of Ramanujan, Raman as friends called him, to come out. So I've already done an academic book on Ramanujan and had a lot of theoretical and abstract discussion about him. So the way Krishna and I wanted to conceptualize these presentations is also, after we discuss and go through some of the theory or ideas, let the words speak, because the ideas are all in there. And I think that's the privilege we have. We can read him now in the first person. We were all familiar, or many of us, with his essays, with his translations, with his poetry. I was very fortunate to be able to access the papers before they were actually stored in a meticulous way at Chicago University about 20 years ago. And I dedicated, as was said, a lot of years to study and research his poetics. That's why when we conceived this book, we wanted to show the artist at work. It's a homage also to an artist, someone who is, of course, struggling, yes. There's self-doubt, yes. But that made him go even further and strive for more. And that aspect is there. And I think all artistic, giving birth to a work of art is struggle. Otherwise, what would it be? You know, giving birth to a poem and even working, as a scholar and trying to bring things and ideas together. So there is a lot of that in there. And we wanted that line of thought, or that line of working as a poet at work, how that somehow inspired a lot of his other work. Because even in his essay writers, he thinks as a craftsman, as an artist at the same time. So art and life, coming back to the metaphor, is very much connected. So I think we would really like to take you on this journey, and it's been worked out in a way that it's chronological, and we'll start with him as a young 19 or 20-year-old student, and as we go along, we can interrupt the readings perhaps and bring in ideas and refer to them so that we can go back to what these texts may tell us or what questions they raise, if you agree. I think that's a nice way of giving shape to his thoughts, and I hope you enjoy this journey as much as we have. And so here we go, Krishna.
Okay, thank you.
Krishna, you'll begin with your
you.
reading from the book,
Yeah.
your selection.
Thank you so much. The first entry in the book is dated from Mysore in 25th September 1949. And what it is, he was 20 years old, and he's writing about a younger self, maybe a few years younger. And it's a narrative about composing a poem. He's writing about writing. And it's a naive piece, fictional account of him, of a character facing this universal struggle of trying to create a poem and being confronted with the banalities of everyday life. And he's in this little bit of a struggle with that. And so he's got this inspiration for this poem, but then his mother keeps calling him to run to the store. His younger brother Vasu is needling him. So I'll begin. It's a naive piece, but reveals a very, actually quite practiced, precociously talented writer. And this is the first paragraph. He was writing a poem, definitely not about the raptures of roses and the languors of lilies. He would not be conventional, old-phrased, a panderist to the lazy public. No, not for the life of him. Tinned poetry, he called it. Stale stuff. Not that for him. Good or bad, he would be himself, write himself, have his own home industry of phrases where he turned poetic pottery at the whirling wheel of his own imagination. He would be clay, pot, potter, painter, and the tanning, fixing sun all in one. The fancy pleased him immensely. He wrote it down in his daybook. He had a small, neat hand with rather feminine curves and angles. He admired it secretly. He thought of a young, worship-eyed posterity. Thought of how he shyly concealed all that behind a modest mask of diffidence, which had the trick of becoming agonizingly real too often, the mask growing into the face. He lopped all those thoughts down. They were getting out of hand. He must think of the poem, his second. Next, we're going to read a very famous poem, A River, which is taught widely. And this poem, what was nice is, what we see in the diaries is he would write about his experiences, and we could see these experiences kind of percolating in him, and they would appear later in poetic form. And this is an example of that, because he was appointed as a lecturer in July of 1951 at Thiagarajar College in Madurai. And so he wrote about these experiences in Madurai while he was in Madurai in his diaries. And also during this period was a time when there were many of these modern Kannada writers, Gopala Krishna Adiga, U.R. Anantamurthy, and a little later he met Girish Karnad. And they were part of this early Navya movement of writers. And they were against literary orthodoxy and religious tradition in general. And they sought a new, modern, experiential ethic, which was coming out of independence, kind of redefining the identity of the country and of themselves. And maybe you want to say a little bit about that period.
Yeah, that was the period, as I mentioned earlier, the high days of modernity. So as most of the students of English literature were taught F.R. Lewis, and then F.R. Lewis had a great influence on our Kannada critics. And Gopal Krishna Adiga had, in a way, started writing in a way which was very new, a lot of overflowing images. And in one sense, as Lankesh comments on Ramanujan, Lankesh is another important writer here, that any great poetry, if it should be great, will have to shake and alter the existing stream. And Ramanujan tries to do that. Another important feature of his poetry that Kannada critics have highlighted is the use of words, even the positioning of the words, the versification, and as I said, the juxtapositioning of various images. And not a single word can be taken away. And if you take it away, the poem crumbles. So it is that kind of tightness with which he writes. And there is also a very interesting comment, because Kannada public came out with a book when after his demise. It's a collection of people saying different things about his poetry, and I will end with this very important and very interesting comment made by Rajiv Taranath, who was also a friend of Ramanujan, who taught English, but then moved to Sarod playing. He says, he uses the imagery of music. Just like a person who is trained deeply in classical music, only such person can also break the tradition. And Ramanujan was like that. He knew his tradition well, and then he could break it, play with it, make fun of it, or even extract new meanings out of that. So that is how and of course, there is also a kind of negative criticism. Negative in the sense, very critical, that someone like S.K. Desai commenting that Ramanujan always uses the past as a peg to hang his modernity on. That's the comment that they make. So I would like you, of course you can read your things, but if you want, you can reflect on this a little later.
I think it's very much there in this poem. We have chosen for several reasons to show his modernist style, and also since he was teaching in Madurai after teaching at ISN College in Kolon, He was in Madurai, and then for a period of time. So this is the 50s where I was teaching at different universities as a young professor. So here it goes. This is an oft-quoted poem, which you will probably all be familiar with, but we thought it's apt because Madurai features very much in the diaries, and this is his voice now in the published version. A river. A river. In Madurai, city of temples and poets, who sang of cities and temples. Every summer, a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair, clogging the water gates at the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches of repair all over them, the wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets sang only of the floods. He was there for a day when they had the floods. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, as usual. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman, drowned, with perhaps twins in her, kicking at blank walls even before birth. He said, the river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, and then it carries away in the first half hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and 1 pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart. So we now go on the journey of his new experience after the period where he taught at a number of universities, and which also took him to Baroda, where he mentions in the diaries how he got really interested in folktale collection and did a lot of field work in Belgaum, and on folktales. And he started his interest in anthropology. He didn't know that he was doing that, but he was collecting poems, tales, of proverbs. So he got into that. He was publishing at the time already a number of, and of course he had been working earlier on radio plays at college also. So he'd been creative in a number of ways. And I think at some point, as he mentions in the diaries, he gets a little, tired of teaching English to bored students at colleges. I think his ambition was beyond, remaining a professor throughout his life. He met colleagues who were going abroad. This is the period people were applying for scholarships. And he, in fact, when he did apply eventually and he made it to Pune to study linguistics, there was an opportunity. He saw a window. He was already 30 years old when he went on this ship, whereas a lot of the others who had made it abroad were probably younger. And but he was very experienced at the same time. So this was very important. Had he left in his early 20s, he would have maybe started earlier his American career. But the fact that he left when he'd already absorbed so much of India, so much of the literature and the vachanas, and not the Sangam poetry, which he got into later when he went to the US, but also the folklore and the proverbs and the oral stories, orality, oral traditions. He had gone very deep into that. And now we have a young professor who is on the journey of his lifetime. He gets a scholarship to study, first goes to Pune to study linguistics, which became crucial for him as a poet and in his career. And he boards the ship, which we mentioned earlier. to go to eventually to Bloomington to study at Indiana University. And the interesting thing about this journey is that here is his first encounter with the new world. Entire new world, new forms which he has to give metaphors to. An entirely new, strange, or he calls it strange, strange, and the strange becoming merged with the familiar, and how it slowly the familiar is taken far away by the sea. He talks about it as he moves on from Bombay to Aden, Suez Canal, and then they come to Malta, and then the ship was supposed to go to the UK. But on the way, one of the engines had shown trouble and was damaged, and it had to stop in Marseille. Luckily for us, because he describes the entire journey overland and his encounter with the masters at Louvre, the paintings in France. So that's why this contrast is so beautifully, and I think you should really read the way he reacts to these foreign experiences. Here's this piece that we've selected because it reflects a bit of that mood. This is, I'm going to read two pieces. This is July 17th, 1959, and most of it is written actually on the letterhead is the Queen Elizabeth or the Strathead, which is another ship he boarded on July 1st. So Malta, the island, was the first encounter with what we can call European, the West, European, though architecture is Mediterranean, still a bit of the East, but very much already Western experience. July 17th, 1959, Malta. To have lived in dozens of such exotic places, till they are exotic no more, to have absorbed them till one understood their life ways and their stress, to live at ease among strangers. Even in India, one could have done all that, but one didn't. One feels like rushing back and gathering all that experience one has missed, all in one back-breaking burden. I seem to have gathered nothing, shared nothing of my past. Every moment seems an alarming fresh beginning. Everyone else has plans because their future continues with their past. I seem to carry nothing, not even ideas. I hope that fear is not true. The more I gather these images, the more intense is my craving to be a writer of prose. Fixing these tantalizing images in words, this haze, the twinkling spangles on the base, the sky fretted by the trees that look through the arches, the penciled aerials, the blood-red oars of a green boat with a red underside, this woman in a white dress with penny-sized spots of black, the blue jersey-decked tennis players, this desire to talk to my steward, and that sad-looking, flaxen-haired small woman with a typewriter, and the sudden responsiveness of an acquaintance, and all the small hours with their heavy procession of the images of my isolation. So at the same time, he felt isolated in that new world.
And continuing in that theme, he famously called himself the hyphen in Indo-American between. And this next reading is what I call a hyphen moment, where he feels always this discomfort with his identity of being between worlds. And there's the metaphor of the journey is especially true here. He's literally between worlds, but this is actually his condition. And he sees this displacement everywhere. And you see this throughout his life. And in these passages, you see his discomfort in his identity. And at the end of this reading, there's a short section on the Indian intellectual, his view of the Indian intellectual in the late 50s. He's talking about the himself really in the 50s as an intellectual, and again, feeling out of place in India. So I'll read this section. This is from 6th of July, a little bit earlier than the selection that Guillermo just read. Afloat with almost no past and no near future but the sea, just afloat in the decks of the present. Discussions are aperitifs. Time seems to have held its breath on a semicolon here, and space has a vague, slow curve going round us all over. Too many people have faith. Easily they speak of unspeakably intense experiences which changed them entirely and gave them and their world a new look. Today it was Miss Malani. Yesterday it was Eknath Iswaran. Both seemed poised in their faith. I feel small and lost and infantile, disturbed by their peace. I was telling a young Australian how isolated an Indian intellectual is, with 16.6% who can read at all, and an overlapping 20% who are in cities like him, and only about 2% English knowing, and still fewer having his rationalist views, with fathers highly educated and mothers ignorant but strong in their hold on him, with every prudent man having a caste and insisting upon it, and he having none, but not modern enough to be entirely abreast of Western ideas, because books don't come too fast to India.
So this journal that he wrote every day on the boat, he didn't do away with it. He kept everything, and it's about 35 pages long. But a few weeks after that, he probably thought that it was interesting material, and this happens quite often, actually. Much later, that he refers to, he goes back to the previous material he's written, and we found this piece where he's actually typing. He's typing some of those diaries and rewriting them, from a more interpretative point of view. And I'm going to read just a few lines of that typed text, which he titles Notes Towards a Journal, The Journey, and that's where we got the title for the book from, which sums up how he feels and what this means to him. But as I said, it's more an interpretation of the early feelings. So I quote, and at this diary piece ends with a quote by Ezra Pound from an imagistic poem. As you know, Ezra Pound, as an imagist, influenced him a lot. And it's also related to this metaphor. Okay. Notes towards a journal, the journey. As one is disengaged from the family, the familiar, everything puts on the stranger look of a symbol. The journey itself, the seed's self-exile, the salt estranging sea, the towboat, the guy ropes, the receding wharf with its belittled crowd, its motley of mothers and wives waiting for the emptiness, the sudden need for telescopes. There's everything here, but everything is anonymous till one sees the faces in the crowd.
Self-portrait. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father.
So what Krishna just read is that very poem, which was previously recited, Self-Portrait. And the reason we've decided to include it here is because recently after the journey, the first draft was found. I found the first draft of this poem, which is about identity and about looking at a mirror, and which is not really a mirror. It's this whole idea. Another very important metaphor in his life is
Would you say,
is
sorry?
Is glass.
Yeah. this
glass.
is one of the first poems he wrote when he
It's
reached.
part of the batch of the first poems he wrote when he arrived in, probably written in Bloomington or Bennington in the first, definitely early 1960. So I was just mentioning that the way he explained how he used some of the very classical metaphors, of course, is the mirror, but for him it was glass, because glass has this amazing quality of being able to refract at the same time reflect. It can have both. That's why he also wrote this beautiful essay, Where Mirrors Are Windows, reflection, reflexivity in Indian literary traditions, which I then changed a little bit and turned into When Mirrors Are Windows for my book. So this beautiful poem is indeed very interesting because it's about optics, about optical reflection, the illusion, so many things. And it's definitely an imagistic poem. It's an image in itself, and what the father means, and it's quite apt that he wrote this at this moment, where he was trying to search for his identity. This is a very interesting period. He joined Indiana. You want to mention this? How he lived in the first few months, years in the U.S., and then we come to probably his first flight experience.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Krishna.
I just wanted to add, you had said that when you found the draft, didn't it mention Borges?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, this is again coming to the idea of identity. He'd scribbled on the side Borges. You know Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian poet. And he mentions the doppelganger, which is the double. So the idea of a split personality, which is, of course, it's there in so many artists and a lot of the genius. He was quite an idea of the mask and the face, this double identity, which also he got from Yeats, of course.
Yeats.
But this particular poem is definitely connected to the idea of the double, and that there's a short story by Borges, I don't know if you've read, where he talks about another Borges. And of course, you know that he wrote that short story in Canada also,
novel,
where he's talking about
Mattubana,
KK.
it's called Mattubana.
Mattubana Atmacharitre. So this idea is already there, and this disengagement from the familiar and the hyphen, and this is a topic I wanted to bring out. But now we maybe have a different experience about images from above on the plane, and you want to introduce those months?
One minute.
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to add that portion of the journey from India to Bloomington itself constitutes a kind of independent narrative.
Yeah.
In the sense,
yeah.
Of course.
you can see
That's
that
quite right.
a person leaving his own mother country, then going out in search of new career, profession, fulfilling his ambition. And he also talks about how ambitious he was, at the same time how ambition sets a goal and limits one. So it's about ambition and still beyond ambition. So that portion by itself is a wonderful read, I think.
I wonder if I could go off script for a sec.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
there's a amazing, speaking of metaphor, he was very interested in dreams, and dreams are natural metaphors for oneself. And in 1971, he recorded many dreams in his diaries. They were always little. He'd put a little D or write dream, and he'd record them. He records his first dream in 1971, and it touches on this idea of ambition. And I'll just read that very quickly here. A dream, one of the first I'm recording, maybe because I want to attend to them and to understand them. Many details lost. A great mansion, but a narrow spiral staircase on which I go higher and higher, fearful of the height, once even falling and clinging to the beam above. Supposed to be going for a poetry reading of my own poetry, which I'd very much like to do, but never seem to get to. I'm taken from place to place, higher and higher, sometimes open balconies, sometimes closed rooms and stairs, but I never get to give my reading. No one is preventing me, it just doesn't happen. relates to my many dreams of climbing higher and higher on a ladder, set against a very tall tower, taller than any I've seen. And as I go up, the ladder falls back and I'm flung out of it and I wake up. Then he says, having to do with my fear of ambition, of not achieving. So this is him dreaming about this idea of ambition and this desire to, he was very ambitious, desire for ambition, but also this doubt that he had of that he'd never quite attain it, of not knowing. So I'll move back to the narrative here that he's on he takes his first flight. I believe this was 1961, 1960, April 1960. And it's another literal journey, but we start to see this habit that he develops of recording new experiences. They were all these journeys and new experiences became an opportunity for him to practice his craft. And my daughter is a dancer. She does hip hop dance. It's a kind of modern street dance, and and within hip hop they're what we call hip hop poets, and they do this thing called freestyling, which is they make up rhymes on the spot. And in a sense, that's what he's doing here with poetry. He has these experiences, and he writes poetry very quickly in the moment, and it's a kind of freestyling of poetry. And as Guillermo will discuss later, it foreshadows a very important kind of moment of him freestyling later with the mescaline notes. But this is the first flight to New York.
Yeah, we've kept, this is important to say also, we've tried to be as faithful as possible to also the shape of the writing wherever we could, and we had to discuss this with the editors. So most of the prose is in regular lines, the way we've kept it. But at times there were pieces which were, as this one, in freestyle, where he'd consciously, because he was very, very, also very particular about line endings. And it looks like it's a poem, and he doesn't jump to the next line unless he's comfortable with word ending, with a line ending. So this is like a prose poem, very, very, very much of an improvised kind of jazzy feeling, okay? So it reads as a poem, it's actually prose, it just as it comes to his head. First flight to New York, 13th April 1960. I got in. It looked like a bus, a good bus inside, with the driver locked out in the front, the air hostess opening the door now and then to let us peek at a panel of dials and red pin lights like a radio station. In the back of the front seat, white bags for air sickness with English and French legends. I read only the French, of course. And the plane started quaking, and I hastily, with great and clumsy care, belted myself into the seat, next to a rather unclean window looking out on a noisy monster of an engine. Then it moved like a ramshackle bus, it seemed to me rather aimlessly, all over the place, and wended its way to a cement strip, nose-led by a small, white, nurse-like little plane showing the way, and started running faster and faster and lunged upwards, step by step.
Beyond Pittsburgh, jags of blue-white flame with a dull red glow at the source, at the side engines. The city looks a Milky Way of sparks and winks, darkness and cigarette stubs, pulled at by invisible faces. Sometimes like a skew plotting of light dots on an IQ graph, with no scatter at all, sometimes like a pointillist Surratt lit up. And Surratt, referring to Georges Seurat, in the late 1800s, a French post-impressionist painter who had devised this style of pointillism, using little dots of color to create this impression of a scene.
So we've only chosen very tiny bit. It's a long piece again, and it's all about the images, the way he looks down and sees paintings, pointillism, because the moment, this experience of seeing something close by and then coming up there in the air and then seeing everything small and little, but at the same time, it's a metaphor of life. So everything becomes metaphorical. By the way, can we turn down the AC on this airplane? It's getting very cold. It's a bit cool, yeah. It's getting very cold now.
With this, would you like to move on to the?
Yeah, we're on the journey. We're on the plane now.
So the plane is landed.
Yeah, it's going to land.
He
It's going
describes
to
the
land.
landing.
Yeah, and it's going to land on water, because the next one is the Striders. So this is becoming one of those planes that can land on water.
Striders, the famous poem by my father, and these entries give a little bit of behind the scenes of the creating of this poem, that he met Howard Nemeroff, a poet. He met him, and Howard Nemeroff was visiting Bloomington at the time. This must have been, when do you think this was? Early 60s?
Yeah, this is 61, I think.
61.
Yeah.
Howard Nemeroff was a poet from Bennington College, which had a very renowned writing program at the time in Vermont, USA. And we got a little glimpse of behind the scenes, the making of this poem. I thought it was very interesting that these were in the diaries, that you could see what was happening to him at the time when he wrote this poem that is very well known. And it was on the tube, actually, in London. And it was the first Indian poet to have the poem on the tube. They created a little poster and put it on the tube.
Was it after speaking of Shiva?
This must have been after speaking of Shiva. Yes, I do think so. Okay. He's talking about Nemeroff here. I didn't tell him I wrote any, but sent him a note of thanks, rewritten 3 times to look casual, with a poem on the Striders, his word, walking on the water we'd seen together.
The Striders, put away this dream and search for certain thin-stemmed, bubble-eyed water bugs. See them perch on dry capillary legs, weightless, on the rippled skin of a stream. No, not only prophets walk on water. This bug sits on a landslide of lights and drowns eye deep into its tiny strip of sky. So we thought it very apt after the airplane to read this poem also, because it's the water and
Bringing it
the
down.
sky. Again, the mirror image, the water is the 2 realities, and from the abstract to the object, and the object. If you look, and this is also very much about meditation, because, when you look at an object in Zen Buddhism, and the moment you can levitate, but the moment you become self-conscious, you drown. So it's about drowning as a metaphor. But I purposely, this is not the published version of the poem, because there's a first line, put away this dream, and then he deleted that, and in the published version in the Striders starts, and search. So, and as we say in Latin, in medias, it starts in the middle of things. So put away this dream. And we thought it apt to mention that he got the idea of the stride as a word. He got it from Nemeroff, and nobody had known this before. Another imagistic poem, again, of course.
And again, also as in the river, we see with this line, no, not only prophets walk on water, that this juxtaposition of tradition, religion, faith, ritual, myth, idols, are replaced by nature, rationalism, realism. He's always turning that around, back to
Nemeroff.
Something very real.
Yeah.
13th October. Today, Nemeroff suddenly dropped in on me in the apartment. He'd liked the poem I sent him on the striding insects and wanted to offer a correction. I thrust on him 3 or 4 poems. He read them so quickly, didn't seem to like any of them. One had too many words. The other was still looking for an elected figure. He was very good about it. He said that Shakespeare was the arch criminal in this and used too many images that didn't get organized. Look at Dante, who prepares his ground, clears it, and lets the image settle in it. I liked his saying this. I feel so greatly drawn to these spare, single-minded, clear-eyed poems that are completely shaped for the touch.
It's interesting to mention here also because, of course, at this time, he exchanges a lot of poetry with other poems because he's part of this creative writing course in Bloomington. And we've seen a lot of the drafts he typed and handed over to the professors, just as the other students probably did. And there are all these comments by his teachers and professors, change this line, delete this, what's this, what's that. A lot of them didn't get the metaphors because they relate to India. And I have to tell you that the material he submitted to his teachers was very, very polished already. And I can assure you, he never paid attention to what they told him. He published these poems as they were. He did never, ever change anything. So though he was full of self-doubt in many ways, he was very sure about what he was doing when he had typed it.
Was it during the course he took?
Yes, so some of the poems that he submitted to the professor became part of the strike. He discarded poems, yes, because he sent in a lot of material to OUP, and it was also thanks to Girish Khanna that this first collection got published in 1966. But I can assure you that of what he submitted, he never heeded what they told him was wrong or what they didn't understand. He was a linguist. He knew what he was doing. So he didn't change anything. He didn't pay attention to others' comments, or at least not that I could see.
But at that moment, when I was reading it, I got this question. See, by that time, he was already an established poet. He had already published, right?
No, he had not published.
When he joined the course?
No, this is early 1960s. He's not published yet. Nobody knows him as a poet. In fact, when he joined in Chicago, they gave him this opportunity to teach a Dravidian course, and then he became a full-fledged professor later on. He had to submit, he had to prove, what have you published? I mean, we want to hire you. And he didn't have a major publication,
academic publication.
Academic, so he showed them the 1966. 1966 publication, the poetry publication. He finishes his PhD on a generative grammar of Kannada in 1963. Yeah. So he was very much influenced by Chomsky, of course. And he was writing all these poems in the early 1960s, hands them over. Friends of his saw them. Some of them got published in Indian rights, a number of journals in India, mainly in India, and he submits a bulk of poems to OUP. Maybe 1/3 of them get published as the Sreedhara. So they don't know him as a poet yet. He doesn't know he's going to become a published poet in English yet. And in 1964, this famous anecdote of him stumbling on the Sangam poetry, the classics, the Tamil classics. That's also 1964. So we're in that period of his time, and we move on to the 70s very soon, which is another very interesting phase. Shall we read from the first passages in his diary where he actually thinks of publishing? You want to read this?
Sure.
The next two?
Okay. Yeah? And so there's this public-private aspect of the diaries, in a theme found in much of his work, the translations and his original poetry. And so what's curious about one thing about the diaries and the journals is the writing was very strong. In fact, we didn't have to edit the writing itself very much because he was very clear in the sentences and the language that he used, and exacting.
He uses a lot of hyphens, though.
Exacting, yeah. And so, what we found, though, is that he had these ideas about actually publishing his diaries. He had aspirations to publish them. So somewhere in the back of his mind was this idea that, was this actually a private journal or something that was going to be out in the public? And so here's a selection. Would you like me to read this
Yes,
one?
please, the
Okay.
next two, if you can do it.
October 26, 1976. I've been writing a journal for some time, chiefly notes to myself, with no pretensions to style or scholarship, but as explorations, passages from one thought or feeling to another. I needed these notes to clear my seeing, settle my roving thoughts, curiously, restlessly, without regard to any discipline in both senses of the word. I needed them even to form my thoughts and to see what I was looking at, to listen to what I was hearing. I am publishing them now, making them public, so that the private might find a place in the largest discussion, just as the larger discussions entered my private journal. So that's very interesting. He was thinking about publishing these, so we've kind of seen it through for him. November 9th, 1979. Fame, fortune, creative vitality in new areas seems missed, coveted, easy for others. Much change one's view of this and one's ways. A stricter diary would help. A better daily schedule, one that includes some writing on ideas as they occur. Maybe publish a journal of ideas, a writer's notebook with no pretensions.
Yeah, this idea gets through. So the diaries are also self-reflexive. He's conscious that he's got some material there that he could do something with it, and he becomes more and more methodological or systematic about it. And there are some entries where he describes that as a process. I think also because by that time he's read other people's diaries and their methodology, and it has to do a lot to do with his interest in psychoanalysis, where you keep your material and your diaries. It's become like a methodology and a therapy, which in turn becomes a creative process. So it's kind of nurturing each other, and as you know, also he was. Yeah, that we come to that. Yeah, so of course his interest in Jung and psychotherapy. So here he says, just to give you an idea how meticulous he was, and then we can perhaps read the other piece where he mentions about he refers to Tolstoy, and then move to mescaline and maybe skip the other part. So. This is March 5th, 1980. He says, I bought a bigger card file for all my diaries yesterday, rearranged them year by year this morning, and felt nice. It gave me some perspective that I've been struggling for. Just glancing through my turmoil. I'm making entries as Progroff. Progroff is precisely the psychologist that developed the intensive journal method. So he refers to that. I'm making entries as Progroff suggests, and this has also been towards giving me some time depth. I have also older diaries. I found one for Madurai, written in 1952, one for 1960, both a few pages. Writing on these slips has been portable and easy to file. That's why I've orderly filed since 1970. So he's not only putting them in order, and that's one of the reasons we could do a book like this, because he was very much interested in this journal method which he describes, and it's part of the creative process. But he's also trying to fish out and find the older diaries. So he's put them all together. That's why it's all there. The corpus, the work is there. And there's this beautiful other diary which Krishna, I'd like you to read now.
So there's a paragraph in here where he talks about my mother. Some of you knew my mother, and she was a very, very strong-willed, kind of force of nature of a woman. And she had a big temper, so it's kind of seen in this entry. And this is again plays on this idea of the public and private diary. Is it for yourself or is it for others to read? This is 5th October, 1980. Trouble writing this diary. Molly said she'd read, Molly was my mother, Molly said she'd read much of my diary, don't know when, and checked against what I said to her and found me a liar. Curious situation. Should one write a diary to suit a possible snooper, a reader over your shoulder? Leo Tolstoy and Sophia, are supposed to have kept 2 diaries, one for each other's spying and to outrage the other when he or she does, and the other truly private. I'm going to contrive to write what I think and feel, for the first honesty is with oneself, and what I don't put down vanishes, as my memory blurs and doesn't keep details. So.
Yeah, we come back to the 1970s. This is an interesting phase because after publishing, Sreedhara's, he got into a number of projects at the same time, but he never seemed quite able to finish them. He did publish Relations, 1971, is the second collection, which is a lot of old material, actually, which he publishes in Relations. And then he's going through this phase where he's immersed in translating, he's already published 1967 Interior Landscapes, right? In the 70s, he did not publish after 1971 a poetry collection in English. That comes much later, Second Sight in 1986. And I always wondered, why is this so? Why did he not publish in all those? He did bring out selected poems. He worked on the Alvar collection, a translation which he published in 1981. So in the 70s, he was working on Nam Alvar and the Alvars. But why was it that he wasn't really publishing poetry in English? And this was a very difficult time in his life, of course. There was a divorce, and there were so many other things, and he was feeling alone, and he went through a kind of experimental phase. And he struggled with the idea of, and that's why also he talks about publishing his poetry. He didn't know whether he wanted to publish prose. So he's thinking of, where does poetry really come from? So he's moving more into meta poetry. And I'm going to introduce these ideas because I want to read some of the mescaline notes, which we also found there. So first, a few ideas about what it means to be a poet, and that connects also with the Sreedhara's poems. And then I read a piece, or Krishna will read a bit of the mescaline experience, which connects to the Soma poetry collection. Well, an unpublished collection, the Soma poems. So in 1976, 30th October, he says, I never thought of myself as a writer. I just write. I'm startled when someone introduces me in print or in conversation as a poet. The poems, too, when they come, surprise me. I feel a poem has chosen me, not me the poem. And this is not being mystical. One is a poet only in the poem. Poets are specialists in what everyone does all the time. It isn't true that once a poet, always a poet, and everywhere a poet, quote in quotes. Then the poet becomes the poet, with capital P. He or she pontificates, sometimes even in the poems. He begins to live like a poet, writing his lives and living his writing. The suffering self and the writing self, bhava and rasa, become one, fused and confused. The results are often brilliant, but usually disastrous to both life and art, and are well known. And here he says, around the same time, the poems, when they come, surprise me. I feel they've chosen me, not me the poem, and perhaps a certain passivity. I need to say, I didn't work for it. I'm not responsible in my nature. For years, I took the Buddhist slogan, take nothing that's not given literally, except I reversed it to take everything that's given, or say no to nothing, which landed me in dreadful dilemmas with food and women. Poetry happens unbidden and has to protect itself. The psychedelic experience taps precisely such experiences. But the junkies see it as a separate state and not as an interruption of the ordinary. Perhaps that is what grace is all about. And this is where the ironic distance comes in. My point is, you can't seek such a state. You can't organize it or take a pill for it. In my Soma poems, for instance, the extraordinary occurs in a most ordinary fashion. Something like the way a poem happens. It's a mystery, but mystery itself is ordinary. Only we make of it something miraculous. Soma.
But one minute before we get into this, since you mentioned the way in which he was looking at the craft of writing poetry, I also found these lines on page 223 interesting. So he's talking about the inspiration part that every writer talks about. So he says, to quote, "In this state of inspiration, meaning being breathed into by a non-self, or entheos, being entered into by a god, important things happen that distinguish it from ordinary states. The speech, the metaphor, a logic of non sequitur, a different sense of time that includes past, present, and future." So he again and again talks about this time, not in a linear sense at all. And then he draws also it from Indian poetry. So that way he looked at the craft of making a poem, in a complex ways. He doesn't totally, rule out the inspiration, but he gives a new interpretation to it.
Yeah, that's true. And one of the very interesting findings, perhaps, in his poetic theory is that though he is a craftsman, he believes in the craft of linguistics and the shape and all of that. In his poetic theory, he is quite a romantic in the sense that we have in the romantics, that of an outer force. It's always there, the creative force, the muse, or something, the poem coming to me, all of that that you have in the 19th century. And it's quite interesting. And I think that is because that's why he was drawn to Namalvar and the Vachanas and the mystic. Where does poetry come from? But he did experience or experiment with other things and substances, and we want to read something which happened in this particular period, and we've not found any other instances. And this is a unique experiment, and that's how it should be framed and seen. His experience with mescaline. You want to read and introduce that?
Sure. And just one last note. And we see in the diaries, in a number of places, of him talking about being a receiver. That he, as a poet, is a receiver. You don't chase a poem.
Yes.
You receive it. And you're a vessel. The poet is a vessel for a poem that would flow in. So, do you want to introduce this period?
Yeah, please read out the August 28, 1971. Okay, I framed it.
Just very quickly.
I frame it. Okay, this is he's in an apartment. A friend of his has allowed him to stay there. He's in Madison, 1971, and a friend of his has given him some mescaline. That it's a substance made of peyote in Mexico. It's a cactus, which was quite in vogue in those, 1960s. I mean, you have to think this is America. This is the US, early 60s. It's the hippies and a lot of stuff going on. But it's also the earlier experiments that Huxley started, and Timothy Leary, experimenting with drugs and writing and art in general. So within that frame, you have to contextualize this interesting experiment where he actually takes the substance and starts writing. And he says that unlike Huxley, he doesn't have somebody next to him recording what's happening. It's himself doing it. So it's a one-man kind of show. And it's there. He hid it. He hid the masculine notes. I think they were hidden because they was not stuck with his diaries. They were with some folk and other material. So please. It was very difficult to read. It starts out very regular, but then very difficult to decipher what he wrote. Very difficult, yeah.
And again, here's an example of him recording his experience. August 28, 1971, Saturday, 6 p.m. Vivaldi, flowing, expectancy, surveying all the objects in front, slight weakness and tremor of limbs. Lying down, evening sunlight fell on my stretched hand with watch. gold and yellow hair. The sun was really reflection in a west-facing window. Now the Beatles, twigs of fear, also color, humor, especially crescendos, color behind the eyes, dry chalk-like feeling in the throat, shiver in the calves. My handwriting isn't clear, getting less coordinated as my forearm muscles are a quiver, a coursing of blood all over. Earlier on, I took account of all fearful objects, tribal spears, the butterfish overhanging, but I'm not going to be afraid. I'm going to meditate, put on Vivaldi again. As I stood meditating, hands together, images of hundreds of hands together, cartoon behind my eyes. As I close my eyes, the after images glow in conventional psychedelic colors, weak yellow sunlight of evening, as in some after fever. Gradually, what appeared as conventional colors turns into a spree, an extravaganza of changing shades and forms. I said to myself over and over, if each of these images, as they turn over, were real, whole lives, I'd have many lives already. That's why I understand, though yet metaphorically, not one, not two, not three or four, but through 8,400,000 vaginas have I come.
Not one, not two, not three or four, but through 8,400 vaginas have I come. I have come through unlikely worlds, guzzled on pleasure and pain. Whatever be all previous lives, show me mercy this one day, O Lord, white as jasmine. So what he does there, he actually embeds that poem in Kannada, in his mescaline experience, because he has this, what he thinks is the experience of rebirth and in images. So the idea of the, one would have to have a psychoanalyst here to understand what he's trying to say, but I think the whole notion of fixity and continuity and flow pervades, because that's what happens when your brain is altered, your vision is altered, so you try to hold on to reality, and at the same time the images, everything you see kind of blends and is free flow. So he interprets it as rebirth, because he's going through this he calls it the bones and flesh, and then everything else is just resistance. At the same time, he's trying to keep control. So it's a difficult situation. And interesting how he brings into this experience Akka Mahadevi. This is a translation. What we just read is a translation of the medieval Kannada Vachana, a famous one, which he had already published. So what happened after this experience, which is quite long, the mescaline notes are quite long. There's a lot of, difficult material to read in terms of it not making much sense. But it does make sense, of course, because it's imagistic. What he does after the 2 days, he's obviously under the influence of the drug, and it slowly fades away, and he starts scribbling very short poems. And there are a few of them which turned out to be published poems. A few, it's mentioned in the book. But he also does get quite obsessed about the idea of an elixir. He tries to relate it to the religious experience, yes, and also to the idea of soma. Where poetry comes. The poets that used to, the idea of soma is the idea of soma as a god, the idea of an elixir, the idea of soma as a drug. What is soma? So he starts writing all these poems about this whole idea of the poet being somebody who is, but in a very ironic mode. Somebody who might have been inspired by an outside source, on whether or not. So it's basically to say that Soma is the poet. So there's a very brief one here. You want to read this, which again connects with another poem. So he's constantly moving between his own poetry and what he's translating, because that he's kind of asking or requesting from the poets he's publishing, please help me find inspiration. It's like a cry out and say, you know, that's why he's quoting all these poets. It's like he's crying out, I'm a poet, please come with me and take me with you. I want to be part of your tradition. I want to write. And he's kind of conflating translations with his own poetry. You want to read this?
Jazz poem for Soma. Soma, why Soma? Soma is not Vishnu. Soma, no mimic similar, has no similitude, grows ordinary as mystery, ancient, familiar, and the always here. Soma's the same as you and you and you. When you make the right mistake and find your best attitude. So, poets beware.
Poets, beware. Your life is in danger. The Lord of Gardens is a thief, a cheat, master of illusions. He came to me, a wizard with words, sneaked into my body, my breath. With bystanders looking on but seeing nothing, he consumed me, life and limb, and filled me, made me over into himself.
Now, like, how much time do we have? It's 1 now.
Slowly coming to an end.
No, I just wanted to check.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
10 more
Okay.
minutes.
I'll just make one brief comment here about the doubts. I won't actually read that.
Yes,
But
yes.
throughout the diaries, we see him talking about his own doubts in himself and in his work. And I came to think that, and Guillermo and I have discussed this, that that his doubts actually were part of his process, and that they actually spurred him to keep working. Because in spite of periods of great success, there's an entry here where he goes through this long list of things that he's published over the last few years, and folk tales, poetry, translations. He's working, and the next year has full of doubts about he's not working hard enough. And I think his doubts kept him striving, and there was a way that they actually fueled him to continue to work. And the other very interesting thing about the doubts is that it did not seem to affect his ability as a poet to bring his highest self to his poetry. The voice of the poet is a very confident, certain, universal kind of. It's outside of himself. It's much larger than him, in a way. And I think that's very unusual, given that in his diaries, he speaks of himself as struggling so much, but he was so prolific, and his highest self came out in his poetry. And I think that's a really interesting dichotomy, one of many. He's full of conflicts and dichotomies, but one of many. And it's an important insight especially for young artists, I think, that to see that all artists have doubts. And this man had his own doubts, but he transcended them over and over and over. And I think that's a great lesson for young artists, that in a way to disregard your doubts in the face of the work.
Because this is perhaps another purpose of the book. I think the book should inspire artists or poets of any kind, anywhere in the world, who embark on this journey of wanting to become artists. Because, and this is, even the editors, they were very young. It was a very young team, and this transcriber, they were all like so absorbed, finding a lot of material that inspired them, because it's very sincere. And I think we want to end with a last piece that I think Krishna wants to introduce before we read the last poem, and then perhaps have a little surprise also, and maybe take a few questions, because the journey goes on, obviously. Now we're close to the early 90s where he's suffering also physical illness. You want to introduce this, Krishna?
Yeah, at the end of his life, he had a lot of pain. He had a small pea-sized tumor growing in his neck, and he night after night when he'd lie down, his legs would hurt, and there was these phantom pains. No one could figure out exactly what was happening. He was very depressed during this time. I lived with him during this period, and in the mornings especially, he was very slow to get out of bed in the morning, and then he would start his day and get busy. And he talked to me a great deal about that, about him getting over the struggle of the morning. But the day he died, my mother and sister and I were at the hospital. He died very unexpectedly, and we were all in shock, and we went to, it was July 13th, 1993. We went to the University of Chicago, what's called the Quadrangle, where there's these big lawns there and these Gothic buildings. And we were sitting there very shocked, kind of in this otherworldly space. And we noticed that the flag of the university's flag, the American flag on the university, had been hung at half-mast. And so we walked over there, and someone had taped this poem, A Hindu to His Body, to the flagpole.
Again, yes. Yeah, we come back to the body and the early ideas. It's all there. This is a very, very beautiful poem. Very ironic, sad, and a celebration at the same time. A Hindu to his body. Dear pursuing presence, dear body. You brought me, curled me, you curled in womb. You brought me, curled in womb and memory. Gave me fingers to clutch at grace, at malice, and ruffle someone else's hair. To fold a man's shadow back on his world. To hold in the dark of the eye, through a winter and a fear, the poise, the shape of a breast, a pear's silence, in the calyx and the noise of a childish fist. You brought me. Do not leave me behind. When you leave all else, my garrulous face, my unkissed alien mind, when you muffle and put away my pulse, to rise in the sap of trees, let me go with you and feel the weight of honey hives in my branching and the burlap weave of weaver birds in my hair.
So I think we can take a few questions from the audience. I'm afraid that there are very few minutes for that, but if you feel like asking, please do so. Introduce yourself, please.
One second.
Here, there is a mic coming.
Hi, this is Raghu. In A Poet's Diary, one of the themes definitely is a deep self-introspection of AK Ramanujan. Now, coming to Matobana autobiography, it's out of print. I haven't read it. Is Matobana autobiography also having a similar trend of introspection, self-doubt, confidence? If you could let us know.
No, I think that's a kind of leitmotif of all his works, particularly poetry. Because if you read the diary also you get this, because there are repeated references to his self-criticism, and there is a deep anguish about his failure, but at the same time he was not a failure outside. So perhaps he was talking to himself through these writings as the other. Because the self and the other is something that constantly, I can't say it worried him, but he's something that he worked upon, perhaps, to understand and give it, because the self-other is not just one individual and the other. It's about two cultures, about how you look into your past, what you make of that past. Because as mentioned, the past, because even he was translating the Vachanas or the Tamil classical poetry, he says that unless it is not a translation, it's in the sense it's a kind of rendition, faithful to the original. It's like another poem that you rewrite from reading the old one. So even this you can see there is a kind of othering himself to look at himself and others from a different perspective.
But I think you could also put it differently. It's more than introspection, it's the multiple selves. You know, the idea of not only the double, but many other selves, multiple selves. So, and of course, he was definitely interested in psychoanalysis, and that it has to do about yourself. But being a Hindu also, and that's why this whole idea of rebirth, and I think continuity, flow, versus the solid fixity, even when he talks in the masculine experience about, you know, how everything's dissolving. And he was a Vaishnavite, you know. Vaishnavite is, what is Vaishnava? Flow. And Alvars, you know, it's about Krishna, it's about Maya, it's about, it connects so many things. And I think that, and everything is somehow having to do with the body. And he was interested in yoga also, and in you know, the physical, the matter, and the unreal, the metaphysical, but in the sense that it just dissolves, which is a very Hindu notion, and that's why a lot of Western readers would struggle to understand. I remember reading Bruce King's. Bruce King is a critic, Oxford University. He's trying to understand his poems in Second Sight, and his later phase in the late 80s. It does become more complex, and the poems, they all become more difficult and more dense. Not difficult, they're just dense. He still writes imagistic poems, but he's just, it's a journey into the self. And what is introspection? You know, everything. Look at Picasso or the big writers, he obsessed with themselves. Everybody's obsessed with themselves and trying to understand and grasp. And there's Picasso all over his paintings. When you paint somebody else, it's him. So it's there, of course. He's doing it through his poetry.
And another man's autobiography,
The Double.
The Double. And I think that was very true for him also, that he was wrestling between this traditional Brahmin part of himself and a modern experiencing man of the world. And I think these two parts of himself were always at odds. And I think he had a little bit of conflict about these two parts of himself. Yeah.
Maybe any other question? Maybe we can end this with a reference. Anantmurthy mentions how Ramanujan's mother was a little upset about he married somebody out of the caste. But then he also performs a certain rituals, not just to please her, but to say that, you know, yes, I also belong here. And this kind of being modern and also to do so, because his famous statement is, I don't believe, but I believe those who believe. So I think that is something that he carried on. And where is this book? Okay. Maybe I should end this with...
Was there any other question?
Yeah, any other question?
Or a comment? It doesn't have to be
Even a comment.
It doesn't have to be a question.
Yeah, it can be a comment.
Well, I think, and you know, my uncle can speak to this as well. You know, the household there was a trilingual household. So, so your father spoke very good English, right? Chinu, Uncle Chinu. He spoke very good English, and so they spoke English, Tamil, and Kannada in the house. So he grew up with all these languages circulating in him. Would you like to say something about that? The house and language, and the language when you were young?
Language, yes. My mother always spoke in Tamil, and my father upstairs is in English. So he always used to say, when he goes out, it is Kannada. So he's both, all three, he proficiently expanded. And he wrote first in Kannada. AK Ramanujan,
He called it
first wrote in Kannada, and then it was returned back. Nobody took it out. And then AKR in Sanskrit, A, K is for my father's name, Kr, and Ra, so A, Kr, Ra. So change it into Akrura. Then they picked it up. All the magazines wanted him to write in Kannada, so many places. So that is how he developed both languages. And then Adiga was very equal. And there was this, they were in Adhunika Kannada. That
Navya.
Adhunika Kannada, that is. So it took up into that also.
Does that help answer your question? Yeah.
Yes, to be educated in English is one thing, but to develop such an imaginative creativity.
Well, I think his father also called him intellectually promiscuous, and in his room he had all kinds of. He was interested in all kinds of study, science, and he certainly was very well read. You can see that first entry that I read. This is someone who's been practicing. This is not a 20-year-old who's just starting to write. He's been practicing for quite a while to be able to write so with such flair at such a young age. So I think that he had been reading and educating himself, but I think he was, I think he obsessed about poetry, all his life. He was always thinking
Keats
about
and
it.
all the classics, yeah.
So,
And also about languages.
and languages, yeah.
He has very famously written about how in his own house, when he moved from the first floor to the second, he would move from one language to another, one culture to another. And the front yard or the place where his father's room was located was full of English, and and then he was also well versed in Sanskrit. And when he went to the kitchen and talked to his mother, it was Tamil, and when he played outside, it was Kannada. So that is how. I think this was picked up later by Anantmurti, who converted it into a kind of theory of.
No, that was him. That
It
was
him.
Ramanujan.
Ramanujan.
He
But
does
then
this.
Anantmurti also has written and talked a lot about the backyard and the front yard as belonging to two different centuries. But
So-
then you are the connection between the two, moving from one to another easily.
So can we hear his voice now?
Yes, we can. But before, since I began with Kannada, there are two poets, important poets, who have given a tribute to Ramanujan. I'll just read few lines from that. One is from Pratibhanand Kumar, who is here. I'll just take one small stanza. Buddhadinda, when he died, the Kannada brought out a book of, what you call, a tribute to Ramanujan. So the poem's title is simply Avaru. ಬುಡದಿಂದ ಬುಡಕ್ಕೆ ಕುಪ್ಪಳಿಸುವ ಗಿಳಿ ಮಾಗಿಯ ಎಳೆ ಬಿಸಿಲಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಗೂಡಿಗೆ ಬರಲಿ ಅಂತ ಹರಸಿಕೊಂಡರೆ ಬರದೆ ಹಾರಿ ಹೋಯಿತು. We expected him to come back to Karnataka, be here. And Anantmurti has written a longish poem, but I'll read only a few lines, called Ramanujan Kavite Odi, on reading Ramanujan's poetry, where he traces a long lineage of great Kannada writers, from Kuvempu to Masti to Adiga to Putina and everybody. And then he says, you don't write like them. ಏಕೆಂದರೆ ನಿಮ್ಮಂತೆ ಬರೆಯುವುದಕ್ಕೆ ರಾಮಾನುಜನ್ ದೊಡ್ಡ ದನಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಲು ನಾಚಬೇಕು, ಆದರೆ ನಾಚದಂತೆ ಹಾಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಬಲ್ಲವರಲ್ಲಿ ಗೌರವ ಬೇಕು. ಪೋಲಿ ಹುಡುಗರು ಬೀದಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕಲಿಸಿದ ಭಾಷೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡುವ ಲವಲವಿಕೆ ಬೇಕು. ಮಾನ ಮರ್ಯಾದೆ ಬಿಟ್ಟ ಈ ಲವಲವಿಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾಚುವ ಸತ್ಯ ಪಿಸುಗುಡುವ ಹುಂಬತನವಿರಬೇಕು. ತಲೆ ನೆರೆತ ಮೇಲೂ ಹುಡುಗಾಟಿಕೆ ಉಳಿದಿರಬೇಕು. ಇಷ್ಟಕ್ಕೂ ಅದನ್ನು ಉಳಿಸಬಲ್ಲ ಗೆಳೆಯರೋ ಪ್ರೇಯಸಿಯರೋ ಸದಾ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಕಡೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರು ಹೇಳೋದು, ಆದರೆ ದಟ್ ಐ ವಿಲ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಲೇಟ್, ನಿಮ್ಮಂತೆ ಸರಳವಾಗಿ ಸಹಜವಾಗಿ ಸತ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಬರೆಯಬೇಕೆಂದರೆ ಗುರು ನಿಮ್ಮಂತೆ ಬರೆಯಬಾರದು, ಇರಬೇಕು. That's what Anantmurti. He says that if you want to write like you and be like you, we should not follow your style, but you should follow your life. That's how he ends that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Both Krishna and Guillermo.
Thank you.
And thank all of you. And before we end, we have a small rendering. Let's listen to Ramanujan himself reading from his poetry. 3 short poems. It will take about 7.5 minutes.
ಪುಸ್ತಕವನ್ನು 1990ರಲ್ಲಿ ಮನೋಹರ ಗ್ರಂಥಮಾಲೆಯವರು ಪ್ರಕಟಿಸಿದರು. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಇದು ಮೊದಲನೇ ಪದ್ಯ. ಕುಂಟೋಬಿಲ್ಲೆ. ಇದು ಚದುರಂಗ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಮನೆ ಹಿಂದಿನ ಸಂಧಿಯ ಕುಂಟೋಬಿಲ್ಲೆ. 2 ಕಾಲಿನ ಇಡೀ ದೇಹ ಮನೆಯಿಂದ ಮನೆಗೆ ಚಾಪು ಹಾಕಿ ಅದನ್ನು ಅರಸಿ ಕುಂಟುತ್ತಾ ಒದ್ದು ಆಚೆ ದಡ ಮುಟ್ಟಿ 1 ಗಳಿಗೆ ಮಾತ್ರ 2 ಕಾಲು ಊರಿ ವಿರಾಮ ಕಂಡು ತಟ್ಟಂತ ತಿರುಗಿ ಒಂಟಿ ಕಾಲಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಹೊರಟಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ತವರಿಗೆ ಬಂದು ಸೇರುವ ಗಂಡಸ್ತನ ಬಲಿಯುವ ಮೊದಲು ಗಂಡು ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಕೂಡ ಮೈ ಮರೆತು ಆಡುವ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳ ಮೈ ನೆರೆಯುವ ಆಟ. ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆ ಸಂಧಿಯ ಈ ಆಟವನ್ನೇ ಆಫ್ರಿಕಾದಲ್ಲಿ, ಜರ್ಮನಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕಂಡು ಆಶ್ಚರ್ಯವಾದರೂ ಬಾಂಬು, ಪೋಲಿಯೋ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿ ವಕ್ರಿಸದ ಕಾಲಿದ್ದರೆ ಕಪ್ಪು, ಬಿಳಿ, ಹಳದಿ ಮೈಯೆಲ್ಲ ಆಡುವುದು ಎಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲೂ ಕುಂಟೋಬಿಲ್ಲೆ ಆಟವೇ ಅಂತ ಅನಿಸಿ ಪಕ್ಕದ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆಫ್ರಿಕಾ, ಎದುರು ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಜರ್ಮನಿ, ಚಿಕ್ಕಂದು ಮುಕ್ಕಿದ ಬೀದಿ ಮಣ್ಣಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಶ್ವರೂಪ ಕಂಡ ಹಾಗಾಗಿ 1 ನಿಮಿಷ ತಬ್ಬಿಬ್ಬಾಯಿತು. ಮುಂದಿನ ಪದ್ಯ ಹಳೆಯದೊಂದು ಮತ್ತೆ ಮನೆಗೆ ಬಂದಾಗ. ನಾವು ಚಿಕ್ಕಂದಲ್ಲಿ ಮೈಸೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿದ್ದಾಗ ಎಷ್ಟೋ ಸಾರಿ ಆನೆ ಮತ್ತು ಆನೆ ಒಂದು ಮರಿ ನಮ್ಮನೆ ಹತ್ರ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಕೆಲವು ಸರಿ ನಮ್ದೇನೋ ತೋಟ ಗೀಟ ಇದ್ರೆ ಅದರೊಳಗೆ ಕೂಡ ಆನೆ ಮರಿ ಬಂದು ಆಟ ಆಡ್ತಿತ್ತು. ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಆಟ ಆಡ್ತಿದ್ವಿ ಅದ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ. ಅದು ಇವಾಗ ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಿ ಬೆಳೆದು ಸಲಗನಾಗಿದ್ರೆ ಅದನ್ನ ಹೇಗೆ ಮನೆ ಒಳಗೆ ಕರ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು ಅಂತ ಅನ್ನೋದ್ರ ಮೇಲೆ ಇದು ಪದ್ಯ. ಹಳೆಯದೊಂದು ಮತ್ತೆ ಮನೆಗೆ ಬಂದಾಗ. ಅಮೆರಿಕನ್ ಪದ್ಯ ಓದುತ್ತಿರ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಅದರೊಳಗಿಂದ ಗುದ್ದಿಕೊಂಡು ಒಂದು ಆನೆ ಮನೆ ಹೊಕ್ಕು ಸೂರೊಳಗಿಂದ ತಲೆ ಎತ್ತಿ ಮನೆ ಮುರಿದು ಧ್ವಂಸ ಮಾಡಿತ್ತು. ಏನೋ ಅಮೆರಿಕನ್ ಮದ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ. ತುಂಬ ಚಿಕ್ಕಂದಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಚಿಕ್ಕ ಮನೆಯೊಳಗೆ ಬಂದು ಮಕ್ಕಳೊಂದಿಗೆ ಚಕ್ಕಂದ ಆಡಿದ ಅರಮನೆ ಆನೆ ಕರೋಟಿಯ ಪುಟ್ಟ ಆನೆ ಮರಿ ಕರೋಟಿ ದಾಟಿ 50 ವರ್ಷ ಕರಿ ಸಲಗನಾಗಿ ಬೆಳೆದು ಮನೆ ಮುಂದೆ ಮೊನ್ನೆ ಬಂದಾಗ ಕಡೆ ಮಗಳ ಮದುವೆ ಚಪ್ರ ಬಾಳೆಗೊನೆ ಹರಿದು ಒಣಗಿ ರಿಟೈರ್ ಆದ ನಾನು ಅಜ್ಜನ ಜೋಲು ತೊಗಲು ಹೊದ್ದುಕೊಂಡು ಕನ್ನಡಕ ಮರೆತು ಹೊರಗೆ ಬಂದು ಬೆಳಕಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕುರುಡಾಗಿ ಅದನ್ನು ನೋಡಿ ಆ ಕಪ್ಪು ಮೋಡದ ಬೆನ್ನು ತಟ್ಟಿ ಮನೆಯೊಳಗೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಕರೆಯಲಾರದೆ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಬೇಚಾಡಿದೆ. ನಾನು 60 ವರ್ಷ ಬೆಳೆದರೂ ಬೆಳೆದಿದ್ದು 5 ಅಡಿ 6 ಅಂಗುಲ. ಬೆಳೆದ ಮನೆ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಸಾಕು. ಮಕ್ಕಳು, ಮರಿ, ಮೊಮ್ಮಕ್ಕಳು, ಷಡ್ಡಕರು, ಅಳಿಯಂದರು ಎಲ್ಲ ಅದರೊಳಗೆ ಹೇಗೋ ಅಡಕ. ಆದರೆ ಅವತ್ತಿನ ಈ ಆನೆ ಮರಿ ಇವತ್ತು ಒಳಗೆ ಬಂದರೆ ಬಾಗಿಲು, ಛಾವಣಿ, ತೊಲೆ, ತೋರಣ, ಹೊಸ ಅಂತಸ್ತು ಎಲ್ಲ ಧ್ವಂಸ. ಆನೆಗೆ ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಅನ್ನುತ್ತಾರೆ. ಆದರೆ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಸದ್ಯ ನನ್ನ ನೆನಪಿಲ್ಲ. ನನಗೇ ಆದರೆ ಏನು ಎತ್ತ ಅನ್ನುವ ನೆನಪು. ಅಂಕುಶ ಹಿಡಿದ ರಾವುತನಿಗೆ 5 ರೂಪಾಯಿ, ಆನೆಗೊಂದು ಚಿಪ್ಪು ರಸಬಾಳೆ ತರಿಸಿಕೊಟ್ಟು ಕಳಿಸಿ ಥಟ್ಟಂತ ಸಣ್ಣಗಾಗಿದ್ದ ನನ್ನ ಹಳೆಯ ಮನೆಯೊಳಗೆ ಬಂದು ಸೇರಿಕೊಂಡೆ. ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು 5-6 ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಭಾಷೆಗಳಿಂದ ಮಾಡಿದ ಭಾಷಾಂತರಗಳಿವೆ. ಇದು ಆನಾ ಅಖಮತೋವಾ ಅಂತ ರಷ್ಯನ್ ಕವಯಿತ್ರಿ ಇದ್ಲಲ್ಲ, ಸುಮಾರು 1936-37ರಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೆದ ಕವನ. ಇದು ಸ್ಟಾಲಿನ್ನಿಗೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಬರೆದ ಕವನ. ಇದು ಇರಾನಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೆದಿರಬಹುದಾದ ಪದ್ಯ. ನಿನ್ನ ಕನಸಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನೊಂದು ಕರಿಯ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಕುರಿಯಾಗಿ ಬಂದು ಕಾಲು ನಡುಗುತ್ತಾ ನಿನ್ನ ಸಿಂಹಾಸನದ ಹತ್ತಿರ ಬಂದು ನಿಂತು ಕೇಳುತ್ತೇನೆ ನಿನ್ನ, ಬಾದಶಃ ಊಟ ಆಯ್ತೆ, ತೃಪ್ತಿ ಆಯ್ತೆ? ಅಲ್ಲಾ ದೇವರ ಕಣ್ಮಣಿ ನೀನು, ಪ್ರಪಂಚ ನಿನ್ನ ಕೈಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸಣ್ಣ ಕರಿಮಣಿ. ನನ್ನ ಮಗುವಿನ ಮೈಮಾಂಸ ರುಚಿ ಅನಿಸುತ್ತೆ ನಿನಗೆ, ಅದರ ಮೈತುಪ್ಪ ಸಾಕಾಯ್ತ ಊಟಕ್ಕೆ ಬಾದಶಃ. ನೆನ್ನೆ ತಾನೇ ಮೈಸೂರಿಂದ ಹೈಟ್ ಪಾರ್ಕಿಗೆ ಬಂದೆ ಅಂತ ಅನಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಇದನ್ನು ನಿಮಗೆ ನೆನ್ನೆನೆ ಒಂದ್ಸಾರಿ ಹೇಳಿದ್ನೋ ಏನೋ. ಎಣಿಸಿ ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ ಸರಿಯಾಗಿ 20 ವರ್ಷ ಆಯ್ತು ಬಂದು. ಎಣಿಸಿ ನೋಡಿದರೆ ಸರಿಯಾಗಿ 25 ವರ್ಷ ಆಯ್ತು ಬಂದು. ಇಡೀ ವರ್ಷ ಒಂದು ದಿನ ಇದ್ದ ಹಾಗೆ, ದಿನ ಗಂಟೆ, ಗಂಟೆ ಒಂದು ನಿಮಿಷ, ನಿಮಿಷ ರೆಪ್ಪೆ ಎಲ್ಲದು ಶೂನ್ಯ ಅನ್ನಿಸುತ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ನೆನ್ನೆ ತಾನೇ ಮೈಸೂರಿಂದ ಹೈಟ್ ಪಾರ್ಕಿಗೆ ಬಂದೆ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಇದನ್ನ ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಒಂದ್ಸಾರಿ ಹೇಳಿದೆ ಅಲ್ವೇ? ಇಲ್ಲ ಭ್ರಮೆಯೋ? ತಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ರೈಲು, ಬೊಂಬಾಯಿ ಟ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿ, ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಹಡಗು, ನ್ಯೂಯಾರ್ಕಿನ ಕಾರು, ಶಿಕಾಗೋ ಬಸ್ಸು ಒಂದರ ಹಿಂದೆ ಒಂದು ಓಡುತ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಹೀಚುಗಾಯಿ ಹುಡುಗ ಒಂದು ನೀಲಿ ಸೂಟು ಬೀಗ ಕೆಟ್ಟು ಹೀಚುಗಾಯಿ ಹುಡುಗ ಒಂದು ನೀಲಿ ಸೂಟು ಬೀಗ ಕೆಟ್ಟು ಹಗ್ಗ ಕಟ್ಟಿದ ಸೂಟ್ ಕೇಸಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಅದರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ 10 ನೀಮ್ ಟೂತ್ ಪೇಸ್ಟು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿಕ್ಕುತ್ತೋ ಇಲ್ಲವೋ ಅಂತ ಅಮ್ಮ ಪ್ಯಾಕ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು. ಮದುವೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಕ್ಯಾಲಿಫೋರ್ನಿಯಾ, ಮಕ್ಕಳು, ಬೆನ್ನು ಮುರಿದು ಸಾಮಾನು ಹೊತ್ತು ಬದಲಾಯಿಸಿದ 8 ಬಾಡಿಗೆ ಮನೆ, ದೊಡ್ಡವಳಿಗಾಗಲೇ 24, ಹುಡುಗನಿಗೆ 22. ಆದರೂ ನೆನ್ನೆ ತಾನೇ ಮೈಸೂರಿಂದ ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬಂದ ಹಾಗೆ ಅನಿಸುತ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಇದನ್ನೀಗಾಗಲೇ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಕ್ಷಮಿಸಿ. ನೆನ್ನೆ ನೀವು ಬಂದಾಗ ಹೇಳಿದ್ನೆ, ಹೇಳಿ ಮುಗಿಸೋದ್ರೊಳಗೆ ನೆನ್ನೆ ನಾಳೆ ಆಗುತ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಪ್ಲೇನ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಂಗೋಲಿಯಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋದ ಹಾಗೆ. ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ನೆನ್ನೆ ಹೊರಟು ಬಂದ ಮಂಗೋಲಿಯಾದ ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟ್ ಒಬ್ಬಳು ಮೊನ್ನೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬಂದು ಸೇರಿದಾಗ ಒಂದು ಇಡೀ ದಿನ, ಅದು ಸೋಮವಾರ, ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಕಳೆದು ಹೋಯಿತು ಅಂತ ಅವಳಿಗೆ 2 ದಿನ ತಲೆ ತಿರುಗಿ ದಿಕ್ಕೆ ತೋಚಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಹಿಂದಿ ಸಿನಿಮಾದ ಕ್ಯಾಲೆಂಡರ್ ಪುಟಗಳು ಸ್ಟುಡಿಯೋ ಫ್ಯಾನಿನ ಬಿರುಗಾಳಿಗೆ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿ ಚರಪರ ಹಾರಿದ ಹಾಗೆ ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ ಹಬ್ಬಗಳು, ಹೊಸ ಹೊಸ ಮಾದರಿ ಕಾರು, ಲಂಗ, ಕೂದಲ ಬಣ್ಣ, ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳು, ಪ್ರೆಸಿಡೆಂಟುಗಳು, ಕೇಳಿದ ಊರಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ದಂಗೆ, ಬಸ್ಸಿಗೆ ಬೆಂಕಿ, ನೆನ್ನೆ ನಾವಿದ್ದ ಲಂಕೆಯ ಹೋಟೆಲುಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಇವತ್ತು ಬಾಂಬು, ಪ್ರಪಂಚದ ಮೂಲೆ ಮೂಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಏಡ್ಸು, ಕ್ಯಾನ್ಸರು, ಭೂಕಂಪ ಅಂತ ಮಣ್ಣು ಮುಕ್ಕಿದ ಸ್ನೇಹಿತರುಗಳು, ನಂಟರು, ಶತ್ರುಗಳು, ಅಥವಾ 4 ಮದುವೆ ಸೋತು ತುಂಬ ಜಿನ್ ಕುಡಿದು ಹಾವೋ ಹೊಳವೋ ಅಮೆಜಾನಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಡಿದು, ಒಬ್ಬನಿಗಂತೂ ಕಾಡು ಪಿಕ್ನಿಕ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಬೆಂಕಿ ಬಿದ್ದು, ಅಥವಾ ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ವಯಸ್ಸಾಗಿ ಹಣ್ಣು ಮುದುಕ ಆಗಿ, ಕೆಲವರು ರಂಪಾಟ ಮಾಡಿ, ಕೆಲವರು ತೆಪ್ಪಗೆ ಕಾಲವಶರಾಗಿ ಸತ್ತು ನೀರಾಗಿ, ಮಣ್ಣಾಗಿ, ಹೊಗೆಯಾಗಿ, ಧೂಳಾಗಿ ನೆನ್ನೆ ತಾನೇ ಮೈಸೂರಿಂದ ಹೈಡ್ ಪಾರ್ಕಿಗೆ ಬಂದ ಹಾಗಿದೆ. ಹಾಗೆ ಅಂತ ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಒಂದ್ಸಾರಿ ಹೇಳ್ದೆ ಅಂತ ಯಾಕೋ ನೆನಪು. ಏನೋ ಮಾತಿಗೆ ಪಲ್ಲವಿ ಮತ್ತೆ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೇ ಹೇಳುತ್ತಾ ಮಲಗಿ ಎದ್ದು ಮಲಗುವುದರೊಳಗೆ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ ಮಗು ಸಂಜೆ ದೊಡ್ಡವನಾಗಿ ಇಡೀ ರಾತ್ರಿ ಎಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಗೆದ್ದು ರಾಜ್ಯ ಆಳಿ ಅಪಕೀರ್ತಿ ಪಡೆದು ಗುಂಡಿಗೆ ಒಡೆದು ಬೆಳಗಾಗುವುದರೊಳಗೆ ಸುದ್ದಿಯಾದ ಹಾಗೆ, ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಮೆಷಿನಿಗೆ ಹುಚ್ಚು ಹಿಡಿದು ಬೇಗ ಓಡಿಸಿ ತೋರಿಸಿದ ಹಾಗೆ ನೆನ್ನೆ ತಾನೇ ಮೈಸೂರಿಂದ ಹೈಡ್ ಪಾರ್ಕಿಗೆ ಬಂದೆ ಅನಿಸುತ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ ಆಗಲೇ ಹೇಳಿದ್ನಲ್ಲ. ಚರ್ವಿತ ಚರ್ವಣ ಅಂತಾರಲ್ಲ ಹಾಗೆ ಕಾಲ ಪುರುಷನ ದವಡೆ ಒಳಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಅವರಿವರು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೆ ಹೊಸದೇನಲ್ಲ.
ರಾಮಾನುಜನ್, ತುಂಬ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಇಂಡಿಯಾಗೆ ಬೇಗ ಬಂದೇ ಬಿಡಿ, ಇಲ್ಲೇ ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆಗಿರಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ನಿಮಗೆ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
On behalf of all of you, thank you for taking us on the journey, Krishna.
Thank you so much.
And it was certainly